He seemed invisible, boring, forgettable, but behind that dead-eyed stare was a monster who couldn't stop killing, even when the bodies started stacking up.
I didn't really think I had an urge to kill her. I just wanted her to stop. And
what did you want to do to her?
what did I want to do with her? Just to have her stop. And
Gary Ridgway wasn't flashy. He wasn't a genius. He didn't have a signature catchphrase or a flashy MO. He was just ordinary. A guy who stuttered often while speaking, who clocked into his job at a truck factory, mowed his lawn on weekends, and blended in so well with suburban life that even when he was a prime suspect in a string of grisly murders, the cops couldn't quite make it stick. But don't let the bland exterior fool you. This man murdered. 49 confirmed, but he claims the number could be closer to 70, maybe even higher. His victims were young women, often sex workers, often runaways, always vulnerable. Gary strangled them with his bare hands or with crude ligatures like shoelaces, ropes, whatever was around. Then he dumped their bodies near Washington's Green River or in the thick woods nearby. And sometimes he'd come back, not to bury them, not to move them, but to violate them again, long after they were dead. It was the early 1980s, and in King County, Washington, bodies were turning up fast. A woman here, another one there. 5 in total, all found in or near the Green River. The media needed a name, and they got one. The Green River Killer. A faceless predator who hunted at night and vanished into the fog by morning. But here's the kicker. The killer was already known to police. Gary Ridgway had been questioned back in 1982. He even passed a lie detector test. The man responsible for one of the biggest murder sprees in U.S. history was right under their noses, and they let him walk free. At home, Ridgway played the part of a devoted family man. He was married multiple times. He was deeply religious, even tried to preach door to door. But all the while, he was searching the red light districts of Seattle, looking for his next victim.
Explain that process to me.
well, one of them was, a woman would get in the car.
She's already in the car?
She's in the car. Let's say she's always in the car. We're driving down the road, and she wants to see my ID. So I whipped out my ID, and with my ID would be I put my finger over my driver's license to hide my name. Mm-hmm. But on the opposite side was pictures. And a picture of my son. And they would see my son, and they would know I was probably a normal person.
But you were really using your son as part of your ruse.
At the time I didn't want to picture my ex-wife there, so I had to have a picture of my son.
Sure, you had to make it sound good.
I had a driver's license on one side, my ID, and then when I showed and then the next picture was my son, so that was, and in the vehicle I had always had some, not always, but had some of my son's stuff in there,
And the scariest part is that he'd often bring his young son along for the ride, as a human shield. See, I have a kid with me. I'm not a threat. That's the kind of calculated manipulation Ridgway was capable of. Cold, heartless, methodical. Where did this monster come from, you may wonder? Gary Ridgway didn't crawl out of the shadows. He was born in broad daylight in Salt Lake City, Utah, on February 18, 1949. The middle child of 3 boys, Ridgway grew up in a house that looked normal from the outside, but inside it was a wreck. His mother, Mary, was a force of nature, controlling, intense, and terrifying. She ruled the house with a tight grip and wasn't afraid to use a belt or stick when her sons went out of lines drawn by her. His father, a bus driver, wasn't any good, often venting about the filth of sex workers he'd see on his routes. That constant commentary would embed itself into Gary's twisted worldview, and fester into a hatred that will lead him to become a nightmare. Gary would later tell psychologists that he felt both anger and sexual attraction toward his mother. The same woman who disciplined him with belts and dominated the house was the subject of his violent fantasies. He even imagined killing her. So far, it sounds like a textbook serial killer origin story. Wait till it gets worse. By high school, Ridgway was already falling behind. He had dyslexia, struggled in class, and got held back a year. His IQ would fluctuate in the low 80s. But what he lacked in smarts, he made up for in something far more sinister. At just 16 years old, he did the unthinkable. He lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him in the ribs, piercing his liver. The boy survived, but Gary Ridgway had made his first real move toward becoming a killer, and no one seemed to notice. No follow-up, no serious consequences, just another angry kid from a rough home. But inside that teenager, something was growing. A rage, a hunger, a compulsion that would eventually take hold and leave dozens of women dead in his wake. Gary Ridgway graduated from Tyee High School in 1969 and did what a lot of young men did back then. He married his teenage girlfriend, Claudia Craig, and enlisted in the Navy. From the outside, it looked like he had found his calling, but Gary never stayed on the path for long. He was shipped off to Vietnam, where he served on a supply ship and saw combat. But it wasn't the bullets that left a mark, it was the brothels. While overseas, Ridgway racked up frequent flyer miles with local sex workers. He even caught gonorrhea, which infuriated him, but not enough to make him stop. That compulsion was already starting to take hold, and just like that, his first marriage crumbled, done within a year. Back in the States, Ridgway gave the word double life a whole new meaning. By the time he married his second wife, Marcia Winslow, he'd become intensely religious. He'd read scriptures out loud at home, cry after sermons, and preach door to door like he was on a mission to save souls. But while he was reciting Bible verses by day, he was cruising the streets at night, looking for sex workers. His appetite was insatiable. His ex-wives and girlfriends said he demanded sex multiple times a day, often in public places, or even in the same wooded areas where, years later, his victims' bodies would be found. To the outside world, Ridgway was weird but harmless. A bit too intense with religion, maybe, a little off, but nothing scary. Behind closed doors, though, Gary was unraveling. He had a sick obsession with prostitutes, and not just lust. It was hatred, too, a burning resentment. He admitted in court that he didn't want to pay them and felt justified in ending their lives. Some believe he was at war with himself, his raw, animalistic urges clashing against his desperate need to feel righteous. That tension between the preacher and the predator would fuel one of the most horrifying murder sprees in American history. While all of this was happening, he had a son with Marcia, a child growing up with a serial killer dad who had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. Gary Ridgway began acting upon his hatred in the summer of 1982. It was then that the lifeless body of his first known victim surfaced along the banks of the Green River. Wrapped around her neck was a piece of clothing tainted with an industrial spray paint, one that wouldn't be analyzed for another 2 decades. At the time, it was just another overlooked detail. But had it been tested, that microscopic trail could have pulled Ridgway into the spotlight much earlier. Instead, he slipped back into the shadows and kept killing. Over the next 2 years, death spread like a plague across King County, Washington, and the Green River became more than just a picnic spot. It became a graveyard. Body after body surfaced along its muddy edges and in dense, mossy woods near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The victims had one haunting thing in common. They were all young women, many of them sex workers or runaways, the forgotten and discarded of society. They were easy prey, and Gary Ridgway knew it. He stalked Pacific Highway south in his pickup truck, armed with nothing but a disarming smile, a wallet full of cash, and sometimes a photo of his son. That image, so ordinary, so innocently paternal, drove his victims into a false sense of security. It was part of his carefully crafted trap. Ridgway would coax the women into his truck, drive to secluded areas, and then, after briefly getting intimate, he would strike with terrifying precision. One arm locked across their necks like a vice, the other pulling tight with practiced force. There was no hesitation, no remorse. He squeezed the life out of them slowly, methodically, until their limp bodies sagged in the seat beside him. Often he'd kill them in his home or truck, other times in the middle of the forest where no one could hear their last gasps. Then he'd dump the corpses in clusters without clothes and twisted among ferns and dirt, sometimes posed in grotesque, degrading ways, their eyes staring up blankly toward the trees. But his brutality didn't end with death. Ridgway revisited his victims' corpses, sometimes days later. He'd return to their graves like a predator guarding its kill, crawling through branches to lie beside their rotting bodies, violating them again. It wasn't about lust, he later confessed. It was about control. Raping dead bodies meant no resistance, no rejection, no cost. He didn't have to pay them and didn't have to worry about being turned in. The silence of the dead was the only intimacy he craved. He went so far as to contaminate his dump sites, leaving behind cigarette butts and chewed gum from other people, scattering belongings that weren't his, all in an effort to confuse investigators. In some cases, he even transported victims across state lines, dumping bodies in Oregon to muddy the trail. It worked. The body count rose, and the killer stayed hidden behind his mask of normalcy. By 1983, the panic had become undeniable. With 5 women dead and more missing, the Green River Task Force was formed. Spearheaded by seasoned officers like Robert Keppel and Dave Reichert, the group was under immense pressure. They were chasing a ghost who left almost no forensic evidence and blended in with blue-collar regulars. Desperate for insight, the task force even turned to Ted Bundy, who, from his prison cell in Florida, offered his own theory. The killer was returning to the bodies for sex. Bundy warned them to stake out fresh dump sites. He wasn't just speculating, he was describing Ridgway's behavior with eerie accuracy. Still, Ridgway eluded capture. He was arrested once in 1982 and again in 2001 for prostitution-related charges, but released both times. In 1983, 18-year-old Marie Malvar disappeared. Her boyfriend and pimp had trailed the truck she entered, a maroon pickup, to a house. That house belonged to Gary Ridgway. The police interviewed him, noted his calm demeanor, and let him go. Other tips named him too, but nothing stuck. A year later, he passed a polygraph test. The man killing women by the dozens was clever enough to beat the machine. What the task force didn't know was that Ridgway was also juggling a personal life that shielded him from suspicion. By 1985, he had met Judith Mawson, a kind, unsuspecting woman who became his third wife. She moved into his modest house in SeaTac, where, unknown to her, countless women had died just feet from the bed she slept in. There was no carpet when she moved in. Detectives later told her that's because he'd likely used it to wrap up corpses. But Judith had noticed nothing. Ridgway played the role of a loving, quiet husband. He brought her flowers, mowed the lawn, and held a steady job at the Kenworth truck factory. When he disappeared early in the morning for overtime shifts, Judith never questioned it. Those hours were when he hunted. Curiously, Ridgway's murder spree slowed significantly after marrying Judith. He later told investigators that she made him feel content, that he truly loved her, and perhaps that fragile connection was enough to curb the storm inside him. Of his 49 confirmed murders, only 3 occurred after their wedding in 1988. Judith herself once said, "I feel I have saved lives by being his wife and making him happy." But love wasn't enough to bury his past. In 1987, investigators collected saliva and hair samples from Ridgway, storing them in evidence lockers for years. It wasn't until the rise of DNA profiling in the early 2000s that science finally caught up to him. A year later in November, while he was at work painting trucks at Kenworth, police walked in and arrested him. 2 decades of horror came to a halt on that factory floor. DNA linked Ridgway to the murders of Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen, all of whom had been discarded like trash across King County. Later, 3 more names were added to the indictment: Wendy Caulfield, Deborah Bonner, and Deborah Estes. The link wasn't just semen, it was microscopic spray paint spheres, matched exactly to the formula used at Kenworth during Ridgway's tenure. That same paint had clung to clothing wrapped around his first victim's throat. The monster had always been right there, driving among them, smiling at coworkers, quoting Bible verses, killing again and again, and still being lucky enough to head home for dinner. By the summer of 2003, whispers began swirling through Seattle's media. Gary Ridgway, the man behind the worst serial killing spree in American history, might escape the death penalty. The idea sent shockwaves through the public. How could the Green River Killer, a man who had confessed to choking the life out of dozens of women and desecrating their corpses, be allowed to live? The answer is a deal with the devil. Ridgway had spent over 2 decades outsmarting law enforcement, blending into society, and leaving a trail of bodies stretching from Washington to Oregon. But now, with the hard evidence finally catching up to him, DNA, paint particles, and recovered remains, he was cornered. His lawyers, led by Anthony Savage, began to negotiate the unthinkable. Ridgway would be spared execution only if he confessed fully to the murders and helped locate the victims still lying in the woods, forgotten. In November 2003, the plea was finalized. The Green River Killer stood in court and admitted to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. But this wasn't a display of remorse, it was a calculated confession, delivered in exchange for life. In his signed statement, Ridgway explained how he had committed every murder inside King County, Washington, and transported a few victims to Oregon, specifically to throw investigators off his trail. It was a long game of cat and mouse, a game he had nearly won. Deputy Prosecutor Jeffrey Baird acknowledged the scale of the deal. 41 of the 48 victims would never have been connected to Ridgway in court if not for the plea. The case against him had evidence for only 7 murders. Without his cooperation, the rest would have remained nameless numbers buried in case files. On December 18, 2003, Ridgway returned to the courtroom, not as a suspect, but as a self-admitted mass murderer. There would be no trial, no debate, just the cold hammer of justice.
Mr. Ridgway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 1 for the death of Wendy Lee Caulfield?
Guilty.
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 2?
Guilty.
Judge Richard A. Jones handed down the sentence. 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole to be served consecutively. 480 additional years, 10 for each victim, for tampering with evidence. While Gary received rightful curses from the victim's family, one statement from a victim's father would break his emotionless facade.
I'm not one of them. You've made it difficult to live up to what I believe, and that is what God says to do, and that's to forgive.
In the months that followed, Ridgway led police to 3 more bodies. On August 16, 2003, a hiker found the remains of 16-year-old Pammy Annette Avent, dumped off State Route 410. Then, in September, the bodies of Marie Malvar, the woman whose boyfriend had once led police to Ridgway's door, and April Buttram were unearthed in shallow woodland graves. 2 years later, on November 20th, a weekend hiker in Issaquah stumbled upon a human skull, DNA would confirm it belonged to Tracy Winston, a 19-year-old who vanished from Northgate Mall in 1983. It was the 49th confirmed victim, and it earned Ridgway one more life sentence. And even decades later, Ridgway's trail of destruction kept unraveling. In 2023, forensic science finally gave a name to a victim long known only as Bone 17. She was 15-year-old Lorianne Razpotnik, last seen alive in 1982. Her remains had waited nearly 40 years to be identified. Over the course of 5 months, Ridgway sat across from investigators, dead-eyed and disturbingly calm, unspooling one confession after another. In some interviews, he claimed 65 victims, in others, 71, and he often couldn't remember names, only places, vague appearances, or where he had left their bodies. On February 9, 2004, prosecutors began releasing the videotaped confessions. What the world saw was not a remorseful man, but a cold, matter-of-fact killer, talking about strangling women like it was part of his morning routine. He admitted to necrophilia without a flicker of shame. He explained that he buried later victims to stop himself from revisiting them because he feared he might not be able to resist. He confessed to picking prostitutes because they were easy to pick up and because he hated most of them. To Ridgway, they were disposable objects. Their lives meant nothing beyond his brief, violent thrill. With 49 confirmed victims, Ridgway confessed to more confirmed murders than any other serial killer in American history. But investigators, and Ridgway himself, believe the real number is much higher. Dozens more women may remain missing, their bodies still hidden in forests, ravines, and rivers across the Pacific Northwest. He now lives out his days in Walla Walla State Penitentiary, where he will never again walk free. The Green River Killer is no longer stalking highways. He's locked behind bars. But the scars he left, the empty chairs at dinner tables, the daughters who never came home, the mothers who died not knowing what happened to their children, those remain. When Gary Ridgway entered the Washington State Penitentiary in January 2004, the man who once roamed highways and backroads as a predator was now just another inmate, stripped of power, cloaked in a jumpsuit, and watched around the clock. But Ridgway was no ordinary prisoner. He was placed in solitary confinement, isolated from other inmates, not for his safety, but for theirs. Even among rapists and murderers, his name carried a weight of revulsion. His crimes were too depraved, too numerous, too cold-blooded. For over a decade, he rotted behind those stone walls in Walla Walla. But then, in May 2015, he disappeared from Washington quietly, flown across state lines, and deposited inside USP Florence High, a high-security federal prison in Colorado. The move went mostly unnoticed. Once word spread, the public backlash was quick and furious. Why was the most prolific serial killer in American history being housed out of state, hundreds of miles from the crimes he committed and the families who still demanded justice? Governor Jay Inslee stepped in. So did Corrections Secretary Bernie Warner. And soon, the message was clear. Ridgway was too important to move off the map. He still held secrets, answers to open murder investigations, clues buried deep in his decaying memory. On October 24, 2015, Ridgway was flown back to Washington State Penitentiary, chained, watched, and escorted by a chartered plane like some twisted form of royalty. He's remained there ever since. But even now, the story isn't finished. In September 2024, Ridgway was quietly pulled from his cell and transferred back to King County Jail, the place where all of this began. The move was unannounced, unexplained, and shrouded in mystery. For days, he vanished from the penitentiary's records, raising questions among journalists and victims' families. Why now? Why him? What did he still know? The silence only deepened until March 2025, when the sealed transfer order was finally made public. The reason: Ridgway was still leading investigators to bodies. More women, more forgotten graves. Even after 2 decades behind bars, the Green River Killer still had secrets to spill. And we may never know all of their names. Many were runaways, prostitutes, or young girls caught in the cracks of society, women whose disappearances barely made headlines, whose families were told they were probably just out there somewhere. But Ridgway knew better. He hunted them because they were easy to forget. In some confessions, he struggled to remember their faces. He gave investigators vague details. The girl I left by the fence, the one with curly hair, the one I went back to. His victims became ghosts, defined only by where they were discarded. Even now, with decades of police work behind it, the Green River case feels unfinished. Some remains were found by hikers. Others were uncovered by dogs. A few were discovered only because Ridgway agreed to speak. And some? Some may never be found, buried so deep in the woods, they've returned to the earth completely. To this day, the FBI and Washington state investigators believe there are still bodies out there, waiting for someone to remember them, waiting for their names. And that's the final, horrific legacy of Gary Ridgway. Not just the number of women he killed, but the silence he left behind. The names we'll never know. The stories that will never be told. Can any punishment ever be enough to make up for the horrors he committed? Or is true justice a pursuit that will forever remain out of reach? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.